Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Future of Work with Jacob Morgan. Today, I have a very, very special guest. I'm sure a lot of you know his name, Gary Hamel. He is one of the world's most influential business thinkers, according to the Wall Street Journal. He's on the faculty of the London Business School for more than 30 years, the author of many, many books, including a brand new one, which I think is coming out in August, called Humanocracy, Creating Organizations as Amazing as the People Inside Them. Gary, thank you for joining me.
Jacob, it's a pleasure. Nice to meet you.
So I actually remember reading a lot of your stuff when I was in college at the University of California, Santa Cruz. A lot of my economics professors and business professors would assign us Gary Hamel reading. And I don't know if you remember this, but we actually spoke at the same conference 5 years ago, the Staffing Industry Analyst Conference.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
Yeah, it was a while ago, and now here you are. So I'm so glad to be able to speak with you and talk to you about your brand new book.
Yeah, same for me, Jacob. Looking forward to it.
So why don't we get started with just a little bit of background information about you, because a lot of people are really interested in the guests that I bring on. So how you grew up, how did you get to become Gary Hamel, advising some of these world's top organizations today?
Well, I guess the real short history is I did get an MBA, and I went to work in a hospital as an administrator. And after, I guess, the first or second week, I knew I didn't want to spend my whole life inside one organization. So I went back, got a PhD. This was at the University of Michigan in the late 1970s. That'll date me. And that was really the first time American industry started getting hammered by global competitors, particularly by the Japanese, Toyota, Honda, and so on. And I watched that play out in the community there in Southeast Michigan. I saw people lose their jobs. I saw communities deteriorate. And it really hit me kind of the personal consequences of poor decisions, or of organizations that aren't able to adapt and change as fast as the world around them. And that kindled a kind of lifetime interest in that problem of building organizations that were capable and that had at their core this energy of innovation and change, and were getting the best out of people. And that's really informed my work ever since.
So what was the first full-time job you ever had working for somebody else?
Well, yeah, I think that was probably after I got my MBA. I went straight from college into an MBA, got that, moved out to California, ended up working as a hospital administrator at Loma Linda University Medical Center, and lovely people and an amazing organization, but it wasn't for me. But I spent enough time there. I was actually there a year, although it didn't take me that long to make up my mind to do something else. But I also got a great sense of what it is like to be in the trenches every day, and to feel sometimes that you were just filling out forms, or that you had to spend too much of your time dealing with bureaucratic BS. And of course, I worked in and for many organizations since, so I hopefully acquired a little bit more wisdom. But I do have a heart for people who are every day are trying to do their best, who want to innovate, who come to work filled with ingenuity and passion, but really struggle often to have the chance to make their biggest impact.
So after that job, did you go off on your own full-time, or did you have a couple other full-time jobs before you kind of made this?
No, I went straight from there into the PhD program, and then straight from the PhD program to London Business School, moved to the UK, a fabulous experience there for a decade, got tenure after the first decade there, spent a little bit more time. At that point, I was doing a lot of work with companies in the US. I think the last year I lived in London, I made 70 trips across the Atlantic. So I figured, well, I guess I just have to do the inevitable. I moved back to the US, but obviously have continued to work with organizations around the world, and have been on the faculty of the London Business School since 1983.
Wow. Hey, that was the year I was born. Fun fact.
Okay.
So, I mean, you've been in this space for a long time. So if you were to look at, if you remember your perspectives on leadership and management when you first got started, maybe in the late 70s, early 80s, to where we are now, has your perspective on leadership changed over the last 30, 40 years?
Yeah, it sure has. I mean, I've been on this kind of a journey of understanding, and it's like peeling an onion, and you just go deeper and deeper. And I guess to put that also in a bit of a nutshell, I came out with really a PhD focused on strategy. And so a lot of my early work was on strategy. And the things that were always the most interesting questions to me about strategy was, one, where do they come from? How do you find a new rule-breaking strategy that will make a difference? And number two, how do you change a strategy that is past its due date? And for some of your listeners who might have that B school background or track management a little bit, you'll remember that Michael Porter made this seminal contribution helping us understand why some strategies are more profitable than others. It's a brilliant piece of work. And I really stood on his shoulders and asked those next two questions. Well, how does a strategy like Google, how does that born? How does that occur to somebody? And can you help people build a capability to find really groundbreaking strategies? So I spent a lot of time on that. Of course, what you learn as you dive in and out of a lot of organizations is that most organizations really struggle to see the future. They struggle to innovate in fundamental ways, which is why it's usually the newcomers who come along. It's the newcomers who create Airbnb or Google or YouTube or whatever it may be. And so I started to ask that next level question, like, why is it so difficult, not for just a few, but for virtually every organization? Why is it so difficult for innovation? Why does that usually happen despite the system rather than because of it? And as you start to unpack that, you realize that at some deep level, most organizations are alike. They're all running with that same kind of bureaucratic model where big leaders appoint little leaders, where strategy trickles down and so on. And so, what I began to realize was there was a kind of DNA level problem here, that inside every organization, there was a management system that had been built to ensure compliance and discipline and efficiency, but there wasn't much there that supported adaptability or innovation and daring and courage. And so that ultimately led me to really understanding the bureaucratic roots that we have inside most organizations and thinking about how do we pull those roots up and build something better.
I don't know if you know this or not, but where did the kind of history of this come from? Like this whole concept of bureaucracy. I mean, it seems like it's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and we've just keep building and building on top of that. And it's a very, and you've talked about this, that bureaucracy and a hierarchy is perhaps one of the most resilient structures that we've ever created. And it's such a hard problem for us to solve, to move away from it.
Yeah, for sure, Jacob. I guess the word goes back to 19th century France, and it simply meant the rule of desks, right? Where in a hierarchy, positions, titles, a rule of desks, and you go up the pyramid. Obviously, its roots are much deeper than that. It goes back in military command structures as far back as we can go. But the kind of bureaucracy you find in most organizations today is a mashup of command and control structures that go back as far as we can go back, and then the more recent disciplines of industrial engineering, which go back to Frederick Taylor, the early 20th century. Taylor believed that there was a one best way of doing every job, and that you can come in with a stopwatch and figure that thing out, and then the goal was to get everybody to do it exactly the same way. So it's really it's the technology of control. It's the technology of conformance. And it made sense in an age where most employees weren't very well educated, if they were educated at all, and where you wanted them to be as reliable as the machines they served. But here we are, hundreds of years later, when most people are pretty well educated at work, where change is happening kind of at split-second speed, where information is very cheap and easy to move around and share. And so that technology, which maybe made sense then, certainly doesn't make sense today.
Okay, that was what I was going to ask you. Is for the time, it seems like the hierarchy made sense because, like you said, there weren't a lot of educated people, and so it was very kind of routine, focused on tasks. But nowadays, it's so easy to learn about pretty much anything. We have a very educated workforce, and we still haven't gotten out of that hierarchy, bureaucracy mentality. And part of it, me wonders, do you think there's also like a trust issue? Do a lot of leaders just not trust their people, and so they just want to keep all the control themselves?
Yeah, I think that's the case. And as you might suspect, that lack of trust kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you don't trust people, it means that you infantilize them, right? You put all these controls, all the report. What are you doing? I mean, I make the point in the book that there's a great irony in the fact that most of us, at some point in our life, we're going to buy a car or two or three as we go through life. Many of us will ultimately buy a dwelling of some sort, and yet those same human beings at work can't requisition a $300 office chair without somebody's permission. And we know from a ton of academic research that when you shrink somebody's autonomy, you also shrink their creativity, you shrink their courage, and people just kind of give up. And so where they may be very engaged in other parts of their life, they're not very engaged at work. And of course, the data backs that up. We know from Gallup and other surveys that far less than 20% of employees are truly engaged in their work. And when you put that together with other data, you really have to conclude that the average organization wastes more human capacity than it uses. But the dilemma is, if you don't give people a lot of scope to innovate, if you put them in a narrow job role, if you only expect them to do what that job requires, if there are no incentives for them to think bigger, then it's easy to come back and at the end of the year say, well, gee, those people didn't do much anyway. They just kind of sat there and did the bare minimum. But that was more a function of the job than it was the inherent capabilities of those people. And I'll just add one other thing. I'm very frustrated when I hear economists and others talk about low-skilled jobs, because I do not believe there's any such thing as a low-skilled jobs. I see people, working on the front lines at Southwest Airlines or Nucor, the big steel company, people of extraordinary talent, very innovative, doing amazing things. But what has happened is we think of these jobs as low-skilled, so we give the people in those jobs very little capacity to grow and to contribute, and then we go like, voila, most of these people are kind of commodities, they're lunkheads, and so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it really says nothing about the capacity of the people in those roles.
Yeah, it's sort of a challenge of looking at human potential as opposed to just kind of the role that they were assigned, which I think is a challenge. So your new book, Humanocracy, I think it's coming out August 18th, I believe. Why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote it really from two very different perspectives, which will probably be apparent to anyone who reads through it. One is kind of the more competitive corporate perspective. Why is it that organizations around the world seem to suffer from the same disabilities? They tend to be inertial, that deep change happens belatedly, usually in crisis, and that's just not acceptable in a world of hyperkinetic change. I was frustrated that organizations are not very innovative when that is so important. We know, for example, from research that while 87% of CEOs think innovation is a top 3 priority, 94% tell you their organizations aren't very good at it. And it was clear they weren't getting the best out of their people. So part of my goal in writing this was we need organizations that are fundamentally more capable than the ones we have now. But you can't build something that's more capable if you start with the same structures and the same principles. You're only going to get incremental gains. So part of it was driven from that kind of almost like a CEO logic of how do I build a company that can go out and win, that rushes out to meet the future, that never takes refuge in denial, that innovates faster than its peers. But the other part was a much more, Jacob, a much more human-centered kind of argument. If you think about where we are right now as a moment in history, in fact, where we've been now, I think for a few years, the establishment around the world has been taking a beating. Whether that it's drain the swamp Trump voters, or whether it's the folks on Bernie's side who wanted to give socialism another go, whether it's the Brexit voters in Britain, the yellow jacket protests in France, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, people agree on one thing. They agree that in many ways the system has not been working for them. And, a recent poll, this is just in May, a recent Harris poll, only 29% of people in America agreed with the statement that the current system works for ordinary Americans. Only 29%.
Yeah,
and
scary.
So, and there are all kinds of policies that have been suggested to deal with that. But it seems to me a lot of that comes back to how people are treated at work. So yeah. if less than 20% of people are engaged at work, if, as we know and we have the data, if only 1 out of 10 employees feel that they have the freedom to experiment at work, if only 1 out of 5 believes their opinions matter at work, then at work people are not going to find much dignity, they're not going to find much opportunity, and they're not going to find much equality, much equity. And so that is, I think, a fundamental challenge for us today. We are up against some incredible problems in our world, from racial injustice to the threat of automation to ethnic strife to climate change and so on. And to tackle those, we need every bit of human imagination and initiative that we can access. And it was clear to me that our organizations were misusing or not using an enormous quantity of human initiative and ingenuity. And that seemed to me like not only an uncompetitive situation, it seemed also unconscionable and needed to be addressed, if nothing else, as just a matter of basic human rights and opportunity.
So one question that we just got from someone who's watching, he says, is leadership also considered part of the system?
Yeah, for sure. Leaders are considered part of the system. One of the arguments I make in my book, though, is we have to really be careful using this word leader, because I think what's happened over the last couple of decades is the word leadership or the word leader and manager have become completely conflated. Yeah. And so, for example, we'll often talk about, as you would know, we'll talk about the leadership team in a company, which, by the way, I think that word is mostly an oxymoron. But I can tell you, if by leadership team you mean the top dozen or 20 people in a company, I can tell you for sure most of them are not leaders. And for sure it's not a team. For me, the definition of leadership is pretty simple. And any of your readers can kind of, or any of your listeners, sorry, can kind of do this as a personal inventory. Ask yourself, if you had no budget at work, if you had no title after your name, what can you get done? And so people who need the stick of bureaucratic authority to get something done, I don't think those people as leaders. Maybe very good administrators, they're not leaders. Leaders are people who know how to mobilize the people around them, know how to get folks to move forward together, and can be catalysts in making that happen. But they're not necessarily defined by a particular place in the organization. So probably since Drucker was writing, we've really known how to train managers. I don't think then or now we really know how to train leaders, but we kind of gave everybody a battlefield promotion when we started referring to managers and leaders. My argument is there are not a lot of managers who are leaders. Anybody can be a leader. It has nothing to do with credentials. It has nothing to do with hierarchy. Whether you have the courage, the compassion, the sense of community to step up and make something happen, even when you lack that positional authority.
I love that example of how you define leadership, because one of the things that I did, so my book came out a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of months ago, I should say, on leadership. And I interviewed 140 CEOs and I asked all of them to define leadership. And they all gave me very, very different responses. Some were very focused on numbers and dollars and cents. Others their definitions had nothing to do with business metrics or goals at all. But yours is the most unique one that I've heard so far. And I just want to repeat it for people. So if you had no budget and no title, would you be able to still get things done inside your company? I love it. I think that's a great example. You also bring up a really interesting point on management and leadership. And I know there's this huge, huge debate between this. And I know I had Bob Chapman. He's the CEO of Barry Waymiller, 12,000 person manufacturing company. And when I had him on my podcast a few months ago, he said that they don't actually they don't even use the word manager or management in their company. They've banned it altogether because their rationale is nobody wants to be managed, and quite honestly, nobody wants to even be a manager at the company. Do you think we need both? Should we get rid of this concept of management and managers altogether and just train everybody to be leaders?
Well, for sure, we are prisoners of our language, and over time, language gets used in a particular way, which then we're kind of hostage there. I mean, the reality is, in our personal lives, at work, there are a lot of things that need managing. There are a lot of things that just don't happen spontaneously, and so let me back up a step. For me, the word management does not refer to a layer. And it doesn't refer to a set of individuals. For me, management is simply the tools, methods, the structures we use to do together what we can't do alone. So anything that helps us combine our efforts, do something consistently with purpose, effectively, multiply our individual capability, that is the work of managing. And in that sense, I think of management as the technology of human accomplishment. So it's always going to be necessary to marshal resources, to make some sort of a plans, to track performance, to give feedback, to think about how we improve, to coordinate disparate activities and efforts. When I look at something like the latest semiconductors and latest systems on a chip that are going to be in the next generation iPhone, I think this is going to be built at about 5 or 7 nanometers of scale. Well, 5 nanometers is the distance your fingernail will grow in the next second. So you think about how much control do you need over how many variables to be able to do something as extraordinary as that? There's a lot of things that need managing to make that happen. I think what happened, and it's a product of bureaucracy and when it was born, is we ended up creating managers as kind of a super class of employees. And so, the role of the manager was to get compliance, to set standards, to make sure there was discipline, to dole tasks and assess performance. And I don't think we need that role in that way anymore. I think most people, most teams today are capable of managing themselves, and yet you do have to. We do as human beings, we have to do very complicated things involving thousands of people. I think about the Atlas detector at CERN, the underground huge project at the Large Hadron Collider. Well, you have a piece of equipment with 10 million parts. The amount of coordination and problem solving that it takes to build something new to the world with 10 million parts is extraordinary. So we do need systems and processes and ways of managing together. What we don't need is multiple ranks of managers who see their primary role as control and oversight. I think that just, that functionality we can achieve in other ways without all the costs that come from, the infantilizing and the extra layers and all the costs that we see every day around us in bureaucratic structures.
It's interesting. So when I was doing research for my book, I was looking at the average age that somebody enters a leadership development program. And I was fascinated to find that most people actually become leaders of some sort, whether you're a supervisor in a retail store or, in the back office. Most people actually become leaders at some point in their mid-20s, early 30s, but they don't actually get leadership development training until they are in their late 30s, mid-40s. So you go for a period of like 15, in some cases even 20 years before you were actually even taught how to lead people. And so at that point, you're just kind of cobbling things together. You're probably influenced by all the weird stuff that's happening around you. And that just to me is insane. I don't know why that's the case. I suppose it's just kind of this traditional mentality that leadership is this exclusive, only a couple people. You have to be at the company for 20 years before you get into this training program. But it seems like that's changing nowadays.
Well, Jacob, I share that same frustration, and you're exactly right. In most organizations, you're probably into your 30s before you get any quotes leadership development. We can come back and debate whether any of that is effective at all. But often, if you look at how that leadership, it's all kind of stratified, right? When you're a new leader, it may be, how do you manage your team, or sometimes even how do you manage yourself, but manage your team. And then you're a little more senior, how do you manage a business unit? And then if you're more senior, how do you manage in a corporate setting, in a corporate role? But the whole inference behind that is that your potential impact in the organization is almost entirely defined by where you sit. And also that the complexity of the problems you're going to address come with seniority and with promotion. So the organizations I profile in my book, let me give you an example. Nucor Steel, by far the most innovative and successful steel company in America. One of the leaders I talked to there said, and this was echoed by many other leaders, he said, being a manager, what we would typically call a leader, being a manager at Nucor is the least noble work, the least noble work. And I was talking to the ex-CEO, he just stepped down, he just retired as CEO, John Ferriola. And he said he had an analyst once ask him, so John, how many people work for you? And he said, what a stupid question. Nobody works for me. I work for everybody else. So what you see at Nucor is small teams on the front lines. These are blue-collar employees, literally hard hat, blue-collar. They are responsible for process improvement. They are responsible for winning customers. They are responsible for innovating steel. They are responsible for proposing and justifying capital investments. They are responsible for setting up shift hours and dealing with personnel issues. So what I see in a lot of the organizations that I'm working with that impress me, Jacob, they have taken the work of managing and they've distributed that down into every single individual. Right? There's a reason that Haier, the largest domestic appliance maker in the world, which I profile in the book, based in Qingdao, China. Haier is an 80,000 person organization with 3 layers. The average company that size has 8 layers. And so they've taken most of the work that managerial class, the bureaucratic class would have done, and they've distributed that to people who are close to customers, close to competitors, on the front lines. And so the whole goal is to upskill those individuals, or let me say this, to put managerial responsibility down rather than to escalate issues up the chain of command.
So we actually had a question come in from somebody else. And they were asking, if you work for someone who is kind of the stereotypical control manager, is there anything that you can do as an employee working for that person to try to get them to change? Or how do you get those types of people to change inside of a company?
Wow, that's a super good question. I mean, the first thing is maybe put my new book on their desk or their workplace, like sometime when you can sneak it in there. I actually do think that will help. But it's a real challenge. And let me just go deeper for a moment on the challenge and then an idea or two on how they might address that. You know, the challenge is bureaucracy is a massive multiplayer game. And it's played for the stakes of positional power, right? The way you get ahead is to move up from team leader to department head to unit manager, and so on, up the chain of command. And each time your salary goes up and your prerogatives go up and so on. And unfortunately, though, playing that game does not correlate very well with creating value. Because the way you get ahead in a bureaucracy is you hoard resources, you get better at negotiating targets, get better at managing up, you manage the optics of your own performance, you learn how to deflect blame, you learn how to pad a budget. And Jacob, in one survey we did for Harvard Business Review, and this is a sample of 10,000 people in organizations around the world, 76% of them said the primary way you get ahead in my organization is to become better at bureaucratic infighting.
That's insane.
So you think, is that really true or not? I don't know. But think about if you believe it's true. If most people believe the way you get ahead is not by creating a new business, not by building a better product, not by demonstrating personal mastery. The way you get ahead is like learning to play that game. It's toxic. And so, but here's the thing. I don't think anybody ever really wants to play that game. You find yourself in a setting where those are the rules, and so you kind of have to learn how to play it. I argue in my book that the problem with bureaucracy is that makes assholes of us all, and we find ourselves behaving at work, in ways that we probably wouldn't with our friends or with our family. So I wouldn't start with the assumption that whoever that boss superior is that they're having a good time as well. In fact, Gallup data says the average manager is less engaged in their employee because very few people really get off by micromanaging other human beings. So I think the big challenge is to help that leader understand there's another way, and there's several ways of doing that. First, you may sit first of all with your team and figure out what could you do that would take some load off of your boss's plate. Right? What does that person least enjoy doing? What is getting in the way of their ability to add value or work on higher value added problems? And go with that attitude of, hey, boss, we think we can help you here. We think we can take some of this burden off of your shoulders. Let us do that. There's a wonderful story in the book about how that's been happening at Michelin, the second largest tire company in the world. I think the second thing that you can do is you can just ask to have an honest, you and your team, I would go in together and ask to have an honest conversation about where your leader, where some of their behavior is demotivating you, where it gets in the way of you doing the best job. In the book, we kind of lay out this almost personal score sheet where at the end of a week, you can look at yourself and say, how often did I act out of that old bureaucratic mindset? And how did it affect my colleagues and people around you? And you have to step up and have a little courage to go have that conversation with your boss and say, listen, there's some things you're doing that are disempowering, or there's decisions you're making that you don't really take into account our best interests. But you have to have the courage to go have that conversation. Maybe not one-on-one. Maybe you go in with a few colleagues. But I would start by asking, where can you take a certain burden, a certain load off your boss's plate? They're probably going to be grateful for that. That gives you a chance to demonstrate some broader competence, and that will get the ball rolling.
It's funny, there have been so many different experiments with structures. We had Holacracy, which I think has since disappeared. There's companies like Valve, which I believe have just a completely flat structure where everybody is just kind of responsible for building their own teams. I think you talked about Morningstar in your book. They have the colleague letter of understanding, which I think is fascinating. And I actually had one of the people who created that at Morningstar 6 years ago as a podcast guest, 5 years ago. But for some reason, this hasn't become mainstream, and everybody's still stuck to kind of these old ways of doing things. And I know things like holacracy largely, I think, failed, kind of disappeared. Zappos tried it, kind of it didn't go very far. So some people might say, Gary, the concept is nice, but bureaucracy is working. We're making money. The companies are more profitable. So how do you respond to some of the naysayers out there who are just like, you know what? It is what it is.
Well, it is easy. It is pretty easy to be pessimistic about all of this.
Yeah.
I remember sitting probably more than a decade ago with one of the great management theorists of all time. I'm not going to mention his name. In fact, I think he was also an economist, maybe even a Nobel Prize winner. And I talked to him about this quest of creating organizations that are fully capable and fully human. And he kind of just said, Gary, I don't think it's going to happen. And there's kind of this attitude that like bureaucracy is a cosmological constant, right? That it's just there and it can never be changed. Well, I don't agree, because human beings invented it, and I think we can reinvent it, but it won't be easy. So let me say just a word about why I think so many past things didn't fail and what might be an alternative. Because believe me, we've looked at this. We've gone back and looked at the last 60 years of organizational innovation before a lot of your listeners were alive, right up to agile teams and mindfulness and holacracy and those things. And let me give it a couple of reasons I think they haven't worked. Number one, most of them did not really start with new principles. They were a set of techniques, a set of practices. And so we tried to graft those new practices onto the old bureaucratic rootstock, onto the old bureaucratic principles. They weren't really DNA level change. And so this is what I see, for example, right now with Agile. So we go in and we set up the Scrum teams, and we give them new goals, and we have Scrum Masters. But we really haven't forced or challenged the entire organization to go back to the fundamental assumptions behind the bureaucratic model, to embrace a new set of principles and then try to elaborate those. So we kind of graft these new practices onto that old rootstock, and then are surprised when it doesn't take. And believe me, I've done that plenty of times in my career. I've worked with organizations. I've tried to, I put in new systems to make them more innovative, and then I come back in a year or two and nothing to show for that. And the analogy it finally struck me. It was like trying to teach a dog to walk on its hind legs. So you can do that. You can remove the distractions, and you can get a biscuit in front of the dog. It will take a few steps. But the moment you turn your back on the dog, it's back on four legs, because it's a quadruped, and it goes like what an idiot. Like, what was that all about? And so first I would say, now we'll come back to this if you want, but you have to go back to first principles. One of the things when you look at the long history of innovation and discovery is you get to the point where you cannot solve the new problems with old principles. So the folks who wanted to understand the subatomic world, they had to basically abandon Newtonian physics. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but it just wasn't going to be helpful in understanding the subatomic world. And they developed a whole new set of principles around superposition and correlation at a distance and so on. The individuals who invented democracy, you had to leave the whole idea of the divine right of kings behind. And I think we're at a similar point when we think about management. We have a technology that was invented for the purpose of control. It did that job very, very well. Now we're in a very different world, and now we have to look in new directions. And yet the principles of bureaucracy, stratification, standardization, specialization, and so on, those are deeply baked into our structures, our systems, our thinking, incredibly deeply baked. And unless you kind of go back and, I would argue that only new principles can beat old principles. New practices will never beat old principles. You can take a new practice and put it on side of it, just like you can have an authoritarian regime. I can run elections. I can have sham elections in an authoritarian regime. It does not make it a democracy. So I think that's the first problem, is that we just kept grafting stuff onto old rootstock without really saying we got to start with a new set of principles. And we try to lay those out in the book. I would say the second problem, Jacob, is a political problem. If you look at people that really study this challenge, the problem you teed up for us, like why haven't these things spread? Why haven't they taken root? The people who've really looked at that universally come to the same conclusion, which is the empire struck back. The new models produced better results. They had huge advantages, but all of them required a fundamental redistribution of power. And, as you may have noticed, people who have power are often reluctant to give it up, often are able to get more of it. And so whatever approach you have to making this change, and we perhaps can talk about that, whatever your approach, it has to be one that overcomes the strong defenders, the entrenched defenders who are quite happy with their bureaucratic privileges, who do not want to be told that we are going to redistribute the work of managing, who don't want to be told that we need an organization where leadership means everybody that is able to lead and not an elect group. And so if you don't have a way of getting around, overthrough that political resistance, ultimately whatever you do will fail. And that's what's happened for those two reasons. We haven't gone deep enough, and we haven't challenged the existing political power structure.
So you mentioned that you actually worked with an organization for a while, and while you were there, they made changes, and then you left, and they kind of went back to the old ways of doing things. So do you personally ever get just really frustrated and angry? Because you've been at this for 30, 40 years talking about this stuff. And it seems like it's a hard thing to do. So I would imagine that you're personally also getting a little, frustrated, maybe angry with some of these companies who say they're going to change when you're there, and then you leave and they kind of just go back to the old ways of doing stuff.
Well, I would say, Jacob, it's really only been, I wrote a previous book that was somewhat on this subject called The Future of Management in 2007. It's really been only over the last decade that in my own thinking, I've kind of unpacked this, at least for me, down to root causes. And so I understand, along the way, I worked with a lot of companies, and I have to say, we have produced billions of dollars in market value. It's not that these things didn't have an impact. A lot of them had huge impact. It's just that 3 or 4 years later, you realize that what you created was a project, you'd done an initiative, but you hadn't changed the DNA of the organization. There wasn't something there that it reverted to the bureaucratic type, if you like. And so it's only been in the last few years. And I have to say, the work we've been doing more recently, where we go into organizations, we crowdsource this problem of reinventing management. We can go to thousands of people today simultaneously on technology platforms and say, guys, here's the new principles. We have to have an organization that's open, that's experimental, that's meritocratic, that feels like a community. Given that, what do you think needs to change? And you have thousands of people talking about practically what they would need to change to make this part of the DNA. And the wonderful thing is when you open up that conversation and you have thousands of people participating, no small group of leaders, however seriously, can stand in the way, right? You can't, the old model of bureaucracy assumed that power trickles down. And if being a leader meant anything, it meant you got to control the conversation.
Yep.
Well, that whole dynamic changes when you connect people laterally. And we've been connecting people laterally for quite a while now with Microsoft Teams and Slack and so on, mostly for the sake of just better managing white-collar work. But when you connect them laterally and you give them permission to hack the management model, then you see some pretty extraordinary things happening, which literally we simply couldn't have done this kind of bottom-up, grassroots, socially constructed change even a decade ago. So we have amazing new tools that let us do this, which makes me very optimistic. We have a generation coming to work for the first time in history who did not grow up in a hierarchical environment. They grew up on the web, which is much more meritocratic, open, and flat. That gives me great hope. And what also gives me hope is there are more and more CEOs now, almost all of them I meet, who are finally willing to acknowledge, Jacob, that the real problem is not the operating model. It's not logistics, supply chain, back office. The problem isn't even the business model. They're finally up against realities that lie outside the performance envelopes of that old management model, and they're increasingly willing to admit it and say, my organization is too slow, we have too many layers, it's too conservative, it's too insular. How do we help this? So, we live for a long time with the side effects of gasoline engines, and finally, kind of the time seems ripe to make that jump to electric vehicles, and it's not going to happen all at once, but it's probably now irreversible. I think we're at the same point in management. Not going to happen all at once, but there's enough energy and enough possibility that I think now it is going to be irreversible.
So you do a lot of work with organizations around the world, and you don't need to name any company names, but do you have any stories or examples that you can share of, when a company reaches out to you, what is it that they ask for? Why do they want to bring you in? And when you do go in, you mentioned, for example, that you crowdsource ideas around management and leadership. Do you have any stories or examples around what these employees in these organizations are asking for, and any changes that you've been able to make based on these suggestions or feedback?
Sure. I'll give you a couple quick stories. I got asked to get involved with one of the most respected technology companies in the world. It's a company that also has a lot of retail outlets around the world. And the question was, how do we turn on all the amazing innovation of thousands and thousands of associates we have around the world? You know, in most retail environments, the people on the front lines are just like there to meet the customer and serve them and get the products out the door. And they had people who are very, very good at that. But what we also realize is every one of those stores is a laboratory where you can try new things and try new services and solutions and so on, but only if you give people permission to do that. And so in that particular case, we built a platform. We built a technology platform that brought tens of thousands of people together, that gave every single person a voice, that equipped them to experiment and try things locally. And that's had a big effect in that business, their pace of change, the rate at which they've been able to evolve their model. And that was simply, recognizing that people on the front lines have these skills. We're underutilizing them. You need to give them a platform, connect them together. So that was a pretty amazing thing to watch that. And that's the most fun thing, is when you see somebody able for the first time in their career to make a much bigger difference than they ever thought capable. Another example where I can talk about the company is something we did for Adidas here in North America. For years, they had lagged behind Nike and Under Armour in growth and margins and so on. And a few years back, their new CEO, Mark King, said, hey, would you come in and help us get rid of bureaucracy and build a more innovative culture in its place? So in that particular instance, we trained a couple of thousand employees how to think like business innovators. Back to your earlier point of why aren't we giving everybody this kind of training? We trained, frontline people, retail people on how to think like this, open up the conversation. They created thousands and thousands of ideas. They could then identify the themes across those that took the company into new opportunities. And so it was, and I remember a story of the number 2 guy at the time in Adidas North America sitting at the back of a room where we'd brought a lot of these people together to share ideas. And the guy had tears coming down his cheeks because, he saw these people so inspired and so excited. They've been asked for the first time in their career to help plot the future of this organization. And then in a second round, we went back and said, okay, you generated tons of amazing business ideas. Now tell us how we need to change our management model. And they did a similar amount of work, brilliant ideas. So Again, though, the technology and the tools to do this are fairly recent. And a lot of CEOs, I think, are still not quite courageous to do it. It takes a lot of guts to say, we're going to open up this conversation and we're going to give 3,000, 10,000, 50,000 people the ability to help to reorient our business and to redo its management model. That's a fairly courageous thing to do. But alternative is stasis and death. So I think more CEOs are looking at this, and I hope Humanocracy gives them the courage to try something. But let me say this: Humanocracy is not. It's not a recipe book. It is not just go and implement this exactly this way and then you'll get the result. I think that was one of the problems with Holacracy. It was highly specified and a very certain set of procedures and structures. I don't think you can do that. I think you have to start with the principles, invite people to think how those principles might be applied in organizations, give them permission to experiment with them locally. Our dream is that every employee thinks of themselves as a management hacker. If you see a system and a process that's not working, or you think you have a better idea, that you can run an experiment right where you are in your organization without asking permissions, don't blow anything up, but start where you are. And most employees do not see, and even fairly senior managers, leaders, do not see that as a possibility. They believe that, unless you have a C in front of your title, your CXO, you can't really change anything meaningful. Well, my whole goal is to say that's not correct. You can make an enormous difference wherever you are if you come at it with the right mindset, and we kind of lay out how to do that.
I like the approach of ask for forgiveness instead of permission.
Exactly. I have to say I get frustrated. I go to a lot of management conferences through the years, and I hear a lot of people talk about these problems. And so often what you hear is the CEO's perspective. So you'll hear Elon Musk, or you'll hear somebody else talk about like what amazing things they did, and you go like, well, that's like great. You're the CEO. Or you have, people like me or others come along and tell you how to do better in your job. How do you become a better marketing leader? How do you become a better digital marketer, or whatever it may be? But what almost nobody tells you, and this is the whole purpose of our book, what nobody tells you is, how do you change the damn system when you don't own the system? But if you look back, all the people who change our world, that's what they do. They're not waiting to be asked. They do not assume they're helpless because they don't have a title after their name. They see a problem, they build a community, they build something, they try something, and they go from there. So these are the hackers, these are the activists who change things. And it's kind of amazing to me, Jacob, that I meet all these CEOs who say, Gary, our organization needs to change faster. So I ask them a question: have you trained every employee to think, behave like activists? Do they know how to build a prototype? Do they know how to build a community around them to go try something? No, we've never done that. So like, how can you complain that your organization can't change fast enough when you haven't taught every single person how to be an agent of change in your organization? Yeah. So, I don't want anybody, when they finish reading Humanocracy, or if they get it in advance, they can take a 4-hour online course. I don't want anybody at the end like saying, I don't have the power to change my organization.
Have you ever had any leaders that you've talked to, whether you're giving a talk or doing advisory work, say that you're full of it? Say, Gary, you know what? Concepts are nice, not going to happen here. Or they just flat out disagree with you, say this is all BS?
I guess maybe they're too polite to say so, usually. But I'm sure there's a good number of people who think that. I guess what makes it increasingly difficult for them is just, the amount of data that we marshal. The data that suggests we're seriously underutilizing human potential is just overwhelming. I remember the first time I came across that data from Gallup that said only, and it depends on the year, but somewhere between 13 and 17% of employees are engaged in their work. And of course, the first assumption you make is, well, it's the work, right? There's a lot of work that kind of sucks. And then I dug a little deeper and you find that 89% of people enjoy their work. So, okay, it's not the work. What else is it? Well, it's the way those people are managed at work. But I remember the first time seeing that data, and to me it was kind of scandalous. And I was thinking, if I was a teacher and somebody told me that at the end of an entire school year, only 17% of my students had gotten any smarter, that would be a problem. Or if I was a physician and after I'd seen 100 patients in a week, only 17% of them had gotten any better, like that would be a huge problem. And so, somehow we've learned to live with this thing year after year, decade after decade. And it's very difficult, though, for anybody to argue with the data. The data is there, and the data says that our organizations are killing the things that are most important about human beings: our curiosity, our intuition, our love, our passion, our courage. And in fact, and by the way, it's not by accident. Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, writing about bureaucracy 100 years ago, he said, bureaucracy succeeds to the extent it dehumanizes the organization. So the data is there. It's hard for anybody to argue with that. It's also increasingly hard for people to argue with the fact that there are organizations that have gone bureaucracy free. And when you look at them, whether it's Svenska Handelsbanken in Europe, whether it's Nucor in the steel industry, whether it's Morningstar, as you mentioned, whether it's higher, when you look at these companies, almost without exception, they outperform their rivals on almost every metric of performance. So I guess there was probably a time when people could say, well, Gary's a bit of a romantic or a bit of an idealist, and this is practical. Like the data says, we got to change, and we have compelling examples of how this is possible. I think what was lacking for a lot of organizations was like, how do you go from here to there? And that's what we've tried to spell out in the new book.
So there are a couple of principles that you talk about in the book. Obviously, we don't have time to go through all of them, but I'll kind of just read through these 8, and maybe you could pick 1 or 2 of your favorite ones that we can go over. So there's principles over practices: power of ownership, power of markets, power of meritocracy, power of community, power of openness, power of experimentation, and power of paradox. Do you have a favorite 1 or 2 there that you want to go over?
Well, gosh, let's take the first one. It goes back to what you were talking about earlier, our whole conversation about who is a leader, and that is the idea of ownership. Again, we know from survey data that about 77% of Americans would like to be working in their own business, right? We all, in a sense, want to be our own boss, and for good reasons. And if you think about what ownership means, it doesn't mean just that you have a fractional ownership of the company legally. What an entrepreneur has, what an owner has, is essentially 2 rights. You have the right to make decisions, it's your business, and you have a right to the rewards that come from when you make a good decision. So let's call that autonomy and upside. And what we know, again, from research, is that for most employees, there's almost zero autonomy or upside in their organization. Less than 10% of American workers have any real financial upside in their job. And that data we talked about earlier, we know that most don't believe their opinions matter at work. And in fact, when you look at some data I saw from the UK, from Britain, says that task discretion has been coming down. Workers are less autonomous today than they were a decade ago, and we can perhaps talk about why. But what you see in all of these kind of this post-bureaucratic vanguard is they built organizations where everyone feels like an owner. So let me go to one we haven't talked about, Svenska Handelsbanken. It's based in Stockholm, 800 branches across the north of Europe. But for 49 years, they have beat their European peer group in return on equity 49 years in a row, without an exception. So extraordinary performance. And yet in that organization, every little branch team is running their own business. They make decisions on how to price the loans, on how to price deposits, on how many employees to hire in that branch. They are responsible for marketing communications with their customers. As a customer, you get the phone number of the local branch manager. And so they said, we want every little branch to be its own bank. They sailed through the financial crisis. They're far more profitable. People on the ground make better decisions and feel more a sense of genuine ownership. So you can do this even in very large organizations. Hire divided their 80,000 person organization up into 4,000 micro enterprises. And in every micro enterprise, those leaders have those same decision rights. They have a substantial financial upside. They can make a multiple, many times over, of their base salary for meeting ambitious targets. And they also get to run it as a business with all the decisions that go along with that. So, I think we've thought that ownership is about giving employees like, 0.00002% of the stock. So you have a few shares. That's a very pale definition of ownership. Ownership means I get to make decisions and I have a financial upside. Nucor, same thing. People on the front lines making big decisions. And if you grow the profitability of your plant and your team within Nucor, you get a huge proportion of those gains as an employee. And that's how it should be. And you find out that when you do that, you unleash all this discretionary energy and imagination that was there all along, but you hadn't created any incentive for it to come to the surface. So ownership is pretty foundational. I wonder, Jacob, to our point we were talking about earlier about training, I really wonder why every single business doesn't teach every single employee the basic, principles of thinking like a business person. The P&L, the balance sheet, what drives this. If you get hired if you're lucky enough to get hired by Southwest Airlines, which hires about 2% of their applicants, you get deeply trained on the economics of the airline industry. If you meet any employee at Southwest, they can tell you last month how that airline was doing on a whole series of financial metrics and what that means for their likely bonus. And same thing in Nucor. So these organizations are investing in building deep business competence, very low in the organization. Because again, as I said, they believe in pushing competence down rather than pushing decisions up. Yeah,
it's fascinating. I love those. I love those stories that you shared. So that's around the power of ownership, and maybe we can talk about one more that you particularly like.
Well, let's talk about paradox for a moment. That's a slightly more subtle and sophisticated, I guess. As human beings, we face paradox in our lives all the time. I'll come back to that in a moment. But organizations are not very good at paradox. If you think of the challenges, I need an organization that is a paragon of penny pinching efficiency, because there's no place in the world for inefficiency to hide today. But I also need an organization that is continuously innovating and a champion of breakthrough innovation. Well, historically, we've seen these things as mutually exclusive. In fact, a lot of management pundits and theorists have said there's this fundamental tension between explore and exploit, right? Between innovation and scale or efficiency. And they've gone on to say the only way you deal with that is if you want to do something that's new, you have to ring fence it. You put it in an incubator and an accelerator. You kind of cut it off from that old, organization that's stuck in the mud and give this new thing the right to flourish. Well, of course, that doesn't work because the old thing is 90% of your business. And if it doesn't evolve, your business dies. But we've been stuck in that view that, this is all either or, and you kind of make a choice. And so, and I think that's wrong. Our view is that you have to take those fundamental tensions, and every employee needs to be aware of them and have the freedom to make the real-time choices right where they are on how to handle those deep trade-offs. So as an employee, I should have the right on a given afternoon to put my feet up on the desk and say, I know that our revenue growth is flat. We need some more ideas. And I sit for the 4 hours of the next day and really just try to be creative and try to think of some new things we can do to drive growth. Or that employee might say, you know what? We are getting hammered by low-cost competitors. Our costs are out of control. I really just need to put all my energy into thinking about how do we take some cost out, where can I find some inefficiencies? So rather than doing that at the top and saying something like, well, we're going to have a headcount freeze, right? That's the stupid way you manage paradox. You just have a blanket statement, no subtlety. We need a headcount freeze. And then, of course, you wake up, 6 months, a year or two later, and the innovation pipeline is run dry. You're not growing, and so you have to solve that problem. We think you have to manage paradox in real time, that those trade-offs need to be localized. And let me give you a little example I think everyone could probably relate to in some way. Think of what it means to be a parent. For those of you who've had toddlers, particularly, or you've watched parents with toddlers, every parent understands the paradox of love and discipline. That a child needs both to grow up into the kind of human being you want them to be. And yet, at any given moment, you're trying to balance that tension. So a child misbehaves, you put them in the corner, you take their toys away, you say, listen, I need you to just sit here for a while and think about what you did. And before you walk away, you give them a kiss, which probably confuses the hell out of the kid. But we trust parents to manage that paradox real time because they have the information, they have the data. What we have in companies is something different. We have a vice president of parenting. So this is if, every month you had to file a report, and then a month later, somebody says to you, oh, we noticed that tantrums were up 30% last month, so we think timeouts need to go up 30%. Like, how helpful is that to an individual parent in a particular situation? But that's how it happens at work. We try to manage these very subtle trade-offs with blanket policies, with top-down mandates. It simply doesn't work. You end up with very clumsy organizations where on average, we are doing the wrong thing, not the right thing. So learning how to localize paradox and how to manage it in a more sophisticated way, which of course means every employee has to have the tools and the information to make the smart real-time decisions.
Now, some might say, and I've heard some people make this argument before, that by putting the business first and making as much money as you can for the business, that helps everybody because employees get more bonuses, shareholders, stakeholders are happy. So what's wrong with putting the business first and trying to make as much money as possible and not putting necessarily the people first?
Well, I don't think this is an either or, but I do think, as the question implies, I do think there is a sequence. When you talk to the organizations we profile in the book, literally, almost universally, what they're going to tell you is our employees come first. And because they understand that only if those people are turned on and excited and feel engaged at work are they going to do their best.
They come before customers?
If they do their best, you're going to have loyal customers, and only then are you going to make money for shareholders. And I think, of course, the goal of a business is to satisfy customers. But as I said many years ago in another book, the P&L is merely a scoreboard, and you run into big problems when executives mistake the scoreboard for the game, right? I used to have this image, if you remember the old baseball scoreboards before they were digital, and people were up there behind there taking out numbers and putting in their runs and hits and so on. I sometimes imagine like half the leadership team was up there like manipulating the scoreboard and has forgotten about like the people down on the field who, have broken bats and, whatever, and you haven't equipped them to play the best game. So for sure, if I see an organization that is systematically losing money, they need to go out of business, right? Or they need a fundamental transformation. But I do believe that if you start by focusing on profits, if you treat that as the game rather than the scorecard, everybody loses.
Well, I know we're at the top of the hour, so maybe before we wrap up and I can ask you where people can find your book, if you have one action item besides getting your book that leaders can take after listening to this podcast, What's the one thing that leaders can do with their organizations right after they listen to this to start implementing some of the concepts of humanocracy?
Ask yourself a very simple question. In what ways and where are we treating people as if they're resources rather than fully developed human beings? And then stop it. Whatever that thing is, stop it. So that's, the heart of all of this is that fundamental view. Again, goes back to the industrial age, but looking at people as kind of expendable, replaceable resources. And I would hope that, one of my dreams, this may be too much to hope for, is that within a few years, no one ever again is going to talk about human resources. We're just going to talk about human beings at work and how we create a work environment where a work environment that deserves the very best that they can give.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Gary, where can people go to connect with you, find out about your book? I know it's already available for pre-order. So anything that you want to mention for people to check out, please.
Sure. If you go to GaryHamel.com, that's real simple, and you can learn more about me, and you can also order the book there. Obviously, it's for sale in all the usual online places. And there's also a website, Humanocracy.com. And I should say, if you go to any of these sites, if you keep a receipt of your book, of your purchase, launching in mid-July, later this month, we're going to have an extraordinary free course that will teach you how to hack management in your organization. And all you're going to need to enroll in that course is to have a receipt, send it to us. We're going to give you free enrollment. It has many of the people I talked about today, the CEO of Nucor and so on, the CEO of Hire, they're all online here. You're going to be able to meet them, learn from them. There's tools, all free. Just need a receipt that you bought the book. So buy it, hang on to it, visit humanocracy.com or visit GaryHamel.com, and we'll help you from there.
Very cool. I love it. Well, Gary, thanks so much for taking time out of your day to speak with me and share some of the insights from your new book.
Jacob, it was a super pleasure. And thanks to all the listeners who joined us today.
Of course. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, my guest has been Gary Hamel. Check out his upcoming book, Humanocracy. And a big thanks to the sponsor for this week's episode, WebEx. Make sure to check out futureofwork.webex.com for some cool resources. And I will see all of you next week. Gary, thanks again.